Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Friday New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, and today is Friday, September 1st, and I'm going to be joined this evening by a dear friend and collaborator, Marcia Mary Baker, who is on the editorial board of Executive Intelligence Review. Marcia, you want to just say hello quickly?
Hello, and good to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. So let me just situate where we are. A couple of things that I think are important to note. We're going to be talking about development corridors, what you could say should have been the peace dividend when the Berlin Wall came down, if people in the United States had any sense and had we not been under a sort of coup d'etat, of which the LaRouche railroading to prison was an important part of. But the world is moving in a completely different direction. And the Western leaders in the city of London and Washington, D.C. are so arrogant and delusional that I think they were really caught very much off guard by the advances of the rest of the world. Really, now at this point, about 2/3 of the world's population, of which 40% or more were present at the recent, actually more than that, if you count the 40 nations plus the BRICS nations, which were at the BRICS summit in South Africa. Now we know that 6 more nations will be joining the original BRICS, effective as of January. And I have to say, this is what also creates the very intense danger, because as Helga Zepp-LaRouche pointed out many years ago when this process was just beginning, but it was clear they were moving with lightning speed. China built tens of thousands of kilometers in high-speed rail in merely a decade. So they weren't waiting for permission or waiting for the West to have a chance to stop their progress. And she said, if you have China with 1.4 billion people, then you've got India with 1.4 billion people, and you have Brazil, South Africa. If you have large nations with a strong scientific, technological capability moving at that pace, the only way you can stop them is by extreme measures, namely war, thermonuclear war. And that is the real danger of the situation now in Ukraine, where even Tucker Carlson is saying that he would be willing to bet his house that we will be in a nuclear war with Russia. My campaign is dedicated to making sure that we are not, that Tucker Carlson would lose his house, because we are going to stop a nuclear war with Russia, because such a thing is simply not survivable, contrary to the idiotic public service announcement that we saw in New York City some time ago. So what I wanted to just do is to give you a sense of the thinking of these leaders, because the American media tries to portray this as a threat to the United States. And even Robert Kennedy Jr., whom I heard speaking, was it last night, or I think so, in Brooklyn, New York, really didn't have a very clear understanding of what the BRICS process represents. It is in no way a threat to the United States. It just underscores how stupid and short-sighted we've been. So to start, I just wanted to share with you, and you can think about this when I get to some of the slides that will allow you to visualize this, the speech by President Vladimir Putin from the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, July 27th and 28th, which I believe was attended by 17 African heads of state, maybe 18, but nearly each of the 54 African nations was represented there in some way. So he begins his speech, of course, by welcoming everybody, and then says, I believe it is symbolic that the Russia-Africa Summit starts its program with this important event, technology and security in the name of sovereign development for the benefit of humankind. That's what the panel was actually called, the opening panel of that summit. And Putin then says, and by the way, this is all available in English on the Kremlin website. This is not secret, but the Western press have chosen to keep it from you. So he says Africa's potential is obvious to everyone. For example, the average annual GDP growth on the continent in the past 20 years was 4 to 4.5%, which exceeds the world's average. Africa's population is approaching 1.5 billion and is growing faster than anywhere else in the world. It is also notable that the middle class, which creates the principal demand for modern goods and services, is growing faster in Africa than in the majority of the other parts of the world. Russia's government, business, and the public are sincerely interested in deepening the multifaceted trade, investment, and humanitarian ties with the continent. And he notes that Russia-Africa trade reached 18 billion US dollars in the year 2022. He said that between 2021 and 2022, Russia's trade with African nations in agricultural products increased by 10% to $6.7 billion. But between January and June this year, it has increased by an additional 60%. Russia exported 11.5 million tons of grain to Africa in 2022 and almost 10 million tons just in the first 6 months of 2023. And he said this has all been occurring despite the illegal sanctions imposed on Russian exports, including, I will say, of fertilizer, which clearly does not have a military use, but would allow people to feed themselves. So you see the evil nature of the British, NATO, American imaginary hegemony is that they're hoping to starve Africa into abandoning their relationship with Russia and China. I don't think it'll work, and it's not working. So then he talks about the Ukrainian trade deal, why Russia, the grain deal, has withdrawn. And he makes the point that 70% of Ukraine's grain ended up in high-income nations, and only 3% of Ukraine's grain ended up in nations like Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia. So he said the reason Russia agreed to participate is we wanted to get the grain to nations which really needed it, but that clearly wasn't the intention. And furthermore, not one single lifting of any sanctions which was promised if we participated, that is the sanctions on fertilizer, the sanctions on certain components needed to produce and move the grain, was lifted. He said we did manage to send only 2 shipments, 20,000 tons of grain to Malawi and 34,000 tons. Oh, no, sorry, not grain. This is now on fertilizer. 20,000 tons of fertilizer to Malawi, 34,000 tons to Kenya. Of the 262,000 tons of fertilizer which are blocked from reaching African and other nations in the European ports. And then he talked about in the next 3 to 4 months that Russia will be supplying free of charge 25,000 to 50,000 tons of grain each to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea, delivered at no cost. So just so you have the sense. Now, why is Russia doing this? Oh, and let me tell you what else they're doing. Russian companies, and this is all from Putin's speech, Gazprom, Rosneft, Lukoil, and Zarubizhneft are involved in developing oil and gas fields in Algeria, Egypt, Cameroon, Nigeria, and the Republic of Congo, not to be confused with the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Republic of Congo's capital is Brazzaville. Over the past 2 years, Russia's exports of crude oil, petroleum products, and liquefied natural gas to Africa has seen a 2.6-fold increase. Rosatom, as I mentioned last week, is building the Al Dabaa nuclear power plant in Egypt with 4 large reactors. I think they're 1,000 megawatts each. And then he talks about promoting deeper cooperation between Russia and Africa in manufacturing, offering preferential loans so that Africans can buy Russian industrial goods. So you say, where's the benefit to Russia? Well, they're going to be able to export all kinds of high-end technology, washing machines, automobiles to the African nations, which are going to have a growing middle class. And this is going to be a huge market. It's already over 1.5 billion people. Would the US ever consider doing this? No. Better to kill them off and steal the raw materials. That's Kissinger's policy, which FDR described as being exceedingly short-sighted, not to mention barbaric. Also, Putin announced that 35,000 African students are studying now at Russian universities, and the number is growing. Now, I'm just going to show you some of the slides and maps so you get a sense of if Africa is the new developing market, the new driver of the global economy, why you would want to have certain kinds of transport corridors reaching various areas of the continent and how that will help. And just before I get to the slideshow, let me tell you, I went to the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, New York last week, and was astounded to learn that after the canal was built, the city of Syracuse had an increase of 40-fold in its population in just one decade. So that gives you a sense of what the power of transportation, the ability to ship goods and services and human beings can do for raising the standard of living and employment. Now, we're going to just go to the slides for a moment here. So this is Helga Zepp-LaRouche, wife of the late American economist and former presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche. This is a conference held last year online, but I chose this because she is holding the New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, which my guest Marcia Baker played a critical role in getting produced. And you see a picture behind her of the transport corridors proposed by herself and her husband, Lyndon LaRouche, really decades ago, but most emphatically since 1996, so really nearly 30 years ago. This is why people like the Russian economist Sergei Glaziev says that the nations involved in this BRICS process are those that have been touched by the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, and why in China, Helga Zepp-LaRouche is known as the Silk Road Lady. Now, here is the project that Putin was discussing at the BRICS Summit, the International North-South Transport Corridor. The blue dotted line shows you previous routes. This shows the International North-South Transport Corridor route. It says the transit time is 25 to 30 days, so really about half of the time, 30% less cost, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Volgograd. And then here, this part is key, right through Iran to the port of Bandar and Bandar-e Abbas. What Putin was talking about in Africa is creating a new maritime route from the Iranian port over here to the ports at Mombasa in Kenya, Djibouti. I guess that would be down here. Mombasa's down here, which has a beautiful, incredible new modern port with 3 segments to it, built in collaboration with China. Djibouti has a new port and certain new rail corridors from there to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. That's what they're talking about. That's what they're doing. Never hear word about it here in the West. So here is another map, perhaps a little more clear about what Russia is proposing. But again, it's outdated because it doesn't have this maritime route from the Bandar Abbas port in Iran coming down to Africa. But you can see some of the corridors that are being discussed, various of the land bridge corridors and the nations that will be and are participating in this. Now, this is just a list of the Belt and Road Initiative enabled economic and logistics subcorridors across Eurasia. This is amazing. So the new Eurasian Bridge Corridor, which includes Belarus, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, 7 other nations, and I think there's more, but my bar is blocking it. It has the key cities, Lanzhou in China, Urumqi, Orgos, Alashanku. I don't know where some of these cities are, ending up in Europe, Warsaw, Duisburg, and Rotterdam. Okay, and they tell you freight and train routes, rail and land, China, Mongolia, Russia, China, Central Asia, China, Indochina, Bangladesh. I would encourage everyone to take this out, just look at a map and think about, I've often had the image that the United States is some kind of horrible black hole where everything ends. You get here and just implosion. It's like a collapse. You come in at our ports and you can't get anywhere because the railroads and highways are completely in a state of disrepair. Our bridges are collapsing. Everyone knows about the train derailments. We now have 3 per day in the United States. And here's just a little description of what's happened, just to give you a sense of the increase from an article. The Belt and Road's first decade is temporally almost coterminous with the China-Europe freight train, which made its maiden journey from Chongqing to Duisburg in 2011. Okay, so that was 2011, just prior to the Belt and Road, which was announced in 2013, 2 years later. If that inaugural run portended trade and logistical connectivity embodied by the Belt and Road, the China-Europe freight train has exceeded its little recognized potential for becoming a transcontinental transport network spanning Eurasia. From one single route to a handful of routes, and we're going to look at those in a minute, and about 80 trains, with only 1 train from Europe back to China by 2013. The China-Europe freight train route grew rapidly over the ensuing decade. The number of, trains, freight trains reached 16,000 in 2020, 16,000 routes, with a cumulative number of 73, or maybe that's how many in 1 year, and a cumulative number of 73,000
trains,
since 2011. So 16,000 trains in 2022, 73,000 trains since 2011. They run on 82 routes between over 100 Chinese cities and 216 cities across 25 European countries, and a number of Central, East, West, and Southeast Asian countries bordering or near China. They carried 6.9 million containers with cargo worth over $400 billion and covering more than 50,000 types of goods by July of 2023. During the first half of 2023, 2,754, 1,563, 4,324 freight trains ran through the Eastern, Central, and Western corridors, respectively, along the China-Kazakhstan, China-Mongolia, and China-Russian borders. This total, 8,641 trains, this is just the first half of 2023, carrying 936,000 containers, was up 16% and 30% over the same period of 2022, and anticipates the total number of trains and containers to surpass last year's figures by the end of 2023. So now let's just look at some of these routes. So think about that. This is while we've been gnashing our teeth, imposing sanctions, which are obviously affecting us much more than they are the nations we're targeting. So here's one of the, you see various sub-routes of this from Shanghai, Beijing, going here. Here's Duisburg, here's Berlin, Hamburg, Moscow, etc. Here's another corridor, which instead of going up this way, goes through the Caspian Sea. and depends on transportation through Turkey, etc. You begin to get a sense of why areas like, Ukraine is up here in Crimea, but Turkey, the Balkans, all of these nations through which you would travel are so very important. Also, these purple lines indicate rail and shipping potentials. You see how dense it is in Europe, so the massive potential there. Oops, and there I will stop. I'll stop. I just think it should be obvious. The world is moving forward in a spectacular way, and Americans used to think this way and don't anymore, but I can assure you Lyndon LaRouche did, and my campaign does, and we have to recruit like crazy. So I'll stop there, and Marcia, please go ahead and let me know if you want any slides.
Right. Well, it's the perfect pickup because you could go ahead and put that up and linger on it. I want to go start with a time of great excitement back in our own history. And this is when the golden spike was driven down in the on the railroad ties in Utah for the Transcontinental Railroad of North America, running from the Atlantic to the Pacific in the United States. So isn't it just a parallel to what you went through now? And the only reason I show it is it's exciting. It happened. I think we're talking about 1869 early. It had been an idea since the 1840s and probably before. And Abraham Lincoln is rightly associated with making sure it happens. And isn't that the point? And in a few minutes, I'd like to zoom in a little more on the back to Asia and Africa. But just almost a generation later, if you show the next slide, Diane, you see how the momentum continued. And this is just an impressionistic one, but the Transcontinental Railway here in the middle that goes through Utah had been filled out. There were still more than transcontinental, just like you showed for Eurasia. There were 2 or 3 more east-west routes, and you had the Mississippi route north-south. It isn't that everything was all filled out, but in one generation, the momentum continued with these corridors. And don't we know that the development was the name of the game? This is where a certain span width along those corridors, you could see new cities, new towns for food processing, new towns for manufacturing equipment, new towns for colleges and for hospitals. And so this was the development corridor in principle, in action, that you showed that on fast forward in the 20th century, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche picked up on this with promoting it through books, through conferences, through writings, because otherwise the 20th century was marked by what? Wars coming out of those networks that didn't want this kind of development. Now, I think that let me pick up on what you said about President Putin, because the conference you mentioned between Russia and Africa was just at the end of July. And I think that I have yet another more simple, if you put it up, North-South International Transportation Corridor map, because, this was a simple one. The red is the corridor going from up St. Petersburg, Moscow, down through, see the red, Azerbaijan, into Iran, then going at one of the ports, either Bandar Abbas, or it could go somewhere else to India. But let me just tweak the blue. The blue is the pre-existing kind of way that cargo would go, which takes 10 or 15 days longer than the red. And so this map doesn't show, actually the other one was similar. What Putin was talking about is we'll draw a new line. We can make it green or something, Diane, in the near future. So visualize. Diane mentioned it could go to Djibouti, it could go to another port, but it could go to Tanzania. It could go all the way down to Durban in South Africa, which is the biggest port, I think, in Africa. But let me just then read, while you look at that, see that red line. And from Iran, it could go to India or not. It could go directly down. Here's what he said, July 28th. Russia is actively reorienting its transport and logistics flows to the global south, including Africa, of course. This north-south transport corridor that we are building is designed to provide Russian products with access to the Persian Gulf, then the Indian Ocean, and then further connections to the shortest sea route to the African continent. He didn't say which ones. He said, naturally, this corridor can be used in reverse to deliver African goods to Russia. Connecting the north-south transport corridor with Africa, launching regular freight lines, which is our goal, and opening a Russian transport and logistics hub in a port on the eastern shore of Africa, he didn't say which, could be a good start of our cooperation. We consider it extremely important to expand the network of direct flights to Africa and to contribute to the development of the railway network inland in Africa. These are the most important goals of our time that we invite our African friends to tackle together. So keep that map there a moment. That has tremendous focus. And you see the Caspian Sea right to the left of where the word Azerbaijan is written. And it's obviously, Azerbaijan is on the West Bank there. This corridor also, by the way, it was a year or more ago when goods did go from Russia to India. It's underway. You can also go to the right bank of the Caspian. You can go down through Kazakhstan, and that's still a north-south corridor, down through Uzbekistan. Well, Kazakhstan can go to Turkmenistan, can go to Iran, and right out to the Arabian Sea. And you can, so this north-south orientation, it's not a transcontinental, it's an intercontinental connection between Russia and Africa. Very exciting. And the other thing I thought after the big picture was given by Diane is, let's zoom in on a lesser known part of the Eurasian map, because there's Russia in the north, China in the east, because Central Asia and Afghanistan is right in the middle of the big east-west corridors that Diane has already shown that have been developed. And remember the date, 2011 is when you had the China-Europe freight trains starting to go. So what's happening in this part, talk about not being reported. Well, let's take right south of where Kazakhstan has its big name, okay? You go farther south through Uzbekistan there, and you get down to Afghanistan where there's only a dotted line. And let's take that. That's like a litmus test for what we could do and who's trying to make it happen. And now we have the chance. Afghanistan might be about as big as Texas. It's big, but not that big. But it has 36 to 40 million people. Its next door neighbor, Uzbekistan, has 36 million people. So you're talking about 70 million people. Now, the idea a month ago is it was signed a month ago. The idea has been around a long time to connect the rail from Uzbekistan there, and the dotted line goes from northern Afghanistan, Mazar-e-Sharif, to Kabul, the capital, and then it could go south to connect to, again, the Arabian Sea, to Africa, to anywhere in the world via Karachi in Pakistan. And remember, one of the big corridors is across Eurasia is China Economic Pakistan Corridor, CPEC. And despite terrible floods and setbacks and dirty operations against it, it's going ahead from China to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and all of Central Asia through Uzbekistan would connect with it. That dotted line that Diane is showing you, the name of it is Trans-Afghan Railway, to Transit Afghanistan. And it has to go across the high Himalayas, but you can do it. It's been proved in Tibet. It's been proved Italy has wonderful mountain engineers through making things happen through the Alps and Switzerland. So I mentioned a month ago, the delegations from Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan have signed everything, feasibility, it's all ready to go. The issue is the funding. That doesn't surprise us, does it? But the promise of the new vector in the world, the BRICS 11, the new development bank, the whole new shift and orientation holds the promise of actually funding this. Now, let me show you another one. Diane, in Western China, no, you can go back and we'll finish Western China and then come to our own.
See if I can go back here.
And if you can't, that's okay. We'll pick up on it.
No, there we go. Got it.
Yeah, there it is. There was one other dotted line. This holds promise. See, it's a dotted line. It doesn't exist. China has built all this rail, thousands of kilometers in general, and over 10, 20,000 high speed. If you go west through China, you get there to Kashi, it's shown, and you see a dotted line into Kyrgyzstan because they still have to use trucks. But guess what? It's a development corridor. They're going to build the rail in that dotted part, go swing over through Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and bang, swing either all the way west to Turkey, go up north to Russia, or go down through Afghanistan in the new Trans-Afghan Railway. But what I just showed you with that little dotted line of trucks in Kyrgyzstan is underway. A year ago, I think this month, a cargo left China, went through Kashi, went on those trucks, and arrived in northern Afghanistan in Mazar-e Sharif. It is happening. And so there's actually coming through in Mazar-e Sharif from Uzbekistan, because the rail's only about 7,500 miles long. But once it gets there, half the aid for the emergency food needed in Afghanistan comes through that rail connection. So all we need to do is extend that out. And again, to say what kind of things would run on it. Afghanistan eats years ago eats more wheat per capita per day than anyone in the world in its wonderful cuisine, with dumplings and bread and all kinds of stuff, Silk Road food. But they need flour mills. They have to import wheat already ground up, because after 40 years of all this strife with the 20 years, last years under NATO and the US, they don't even have enough flour mills. So you need to import equipment, electrical goods, build up the nation. So all these corridors of development, the discussion is very concrete. The studies, it's not just studying it to death. Things are ready to go. So then let's just end on our own hemisphere and New York State. But if we continue with our Western hemisphere, I just picked a vision to remind us that in the 20th century, this is a highway map for the PanAmerican Highway. There was a normal approach to our hemisphere of thinking, well, we should be able to drive all the way from Alaska down through Western Canada, a couple of routes through the US, into Mexico, Central America, cross the Darien Gap, which is full of mosquitoes and swamps, but we can do it, and go all the way down where it's handy along the western spine there, and get down to the southernmost part of South America. Now, very little of that was built. When it was still unpaved, when I was 18, I drove the Alaskan Highway 18 miles. We should have paved. I figured we were going to pave it, a few years later. It took them 20, 30 years. We should have railroads along this route. Clearly, this is where we were. We've been retarded by casino economics and geopolitics for 60 years or more. So this is what we didn't do. And this is what should have been on the agenda. And let's leave that there for a minute. Now we get to what the condition of what we do have in the United States, because we were building railroads here, as I indicated. By the 1880s, we were going gangbusters, and by about 1920, that was the peak. We had something like 250,000 miles of railway in this country, and then it started. It was still very capable, but it started to decrease, and now it's down, I think, maybe 140,000 miles of track taken out all over. You see it in New York State, you see it all over the country, former towns that were served. I mean, in places like New York State and Pennsylvania, very rural farm children, they went on to school by rail sometimes, picked them up on a siding and just took them to the county seat. So anyway, we have, as the National League of Cities said, 3 derailments a day. Some of them are small, some of them are like East Palestine in Ohio. And so the maintenance is down. The number of crews, the trainmen per train is way down. And it's not just that. I just want to add one other thing. If you go to the next slide, we have a very irrational system of where the trains do serve. And what I got this map today from off the site, if you want to look at it. It's an intermodal, mostly rail map from the U.S. Grains Council. What's happened in the last 50, 60 years of geopolitics and so-called free trade is take those orange lines. There's different companies represented here. I think this comes from Burlington, BSNF, Burlington, whatever. And I'm not sure which map. Now, those orange lines are priorities for moving out U.S. grain, which the free trade transnational companies out of Wall Street and London said, we're going to control. We're going to tell a country like Mexico that originated corn that you are to not grow more corn. Nebraska will grow your corn. And those orange rail lines run the grain down into Mexico. See the lines in Mexico. So some of the new upgraded railroad tracks, sidings, elevators are strictly were determined to serve transnationals, getting American farmers to grow grain and telling Mexico, get it from here. Now, there's a big fight. I don't want to go into it, but about Mexico saying we don't want to do it anymore. And that's a story for another symposium, I think, Diane. But what I want to point out about this is the solution is to get with the program, literally, programs of nation serving and continent serving mutual interest orientation here and have rail, and anything lesser doesn't do. So 2 days ago here in Washington, where I'm speaking from, the Washington Post said, we're in a rail renaissance. You might not know that, Diane. There are 5 projects for passenger rail. See, in Florida this week, a couple of 250 miles was open. You can now go on fast rail between Miami and Orlando. So the Washington Post calls that a renaissance. And they say one day you'll be able to do that in Washington, Oregon, and between San Francisco and LA. So I just end on that note of stupidity, because I think one of the biggest threats, I couldn't help but notice this, is in reorienting our own country. A couple days ago, the Department of Health and Human Services, for the first time ever, asked the Federal Drug Administration, FDA, to see if it would be okay now to federally legalize marijuana in the country. I mean, you're not going to have any minds to do anything. And we just reviewed what we ought to be doing. And I guess that's where I'll leave it.
Well, thanks a lot. I think from those maps, the other thing that would be worth overlaying once we have the picture is the migrant flows, because you can either have corridors of economic development or you can have corridors of human trafficking, drug trafficking, and hideous looting, which again, as FDR recognized, is extremely short-sighted. It will immiserate people and it will lead to more misery, while a tiny handful might get rich and then burn in hell when they die. um, but I actually think this is a very exciting picture. What do you think should be an approach for the United States in this regard? What would be the priorities if we were to have a crash program to start addressing this mess we have?
Well, I think we should have the 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of elements you should expect. Absolutely go for maintenance of and make the existing system not be a death trap, and have the derailments, the fire may and that takes certain governmental arrangements where you tell the railroads what to do that have been privatized. But this, you do this in a context of delineating what are the exciting development corridors that we ought to have. We've never built the Alaska Western Canada rail connection. It's crazy that was not done, because it's been surveyed during World War II by the Army Corps of Engineers. They did a crash 6-month survey, and they know the route that the rail connection should run. But then within our country, Canada, Mexico, you would look at the kind of main hubs that you pre-existing could rebuild up: New York, Chicago, and westward, and Philadelphia and so forth, and westward. And then as you keep going, and the coast and north and south, with the prospect that rebuilding in this way and reorienting trade, because I showed a transnational grain hauling map, reboot, rewind the trade, and look forward to developing new cities, new agriculture areas. And that means, especially in the Midwest, Western states, and that will mean doing waterworks projects in conjunction with this, because you have a problem, and going to advanced energy instead of the retrograde solar and wind, to go back to nuclear power and good use of coal and other things. So that, I think it's a package deal. It's been laid out. You can say more. I like to say there's a new form at Schiller Institute programmatic picture coming out next week, looking at the whole world on what do we mean if the global north and the global south get together in terms of jobs, projects by continent, and reorienting the United States for growth in partnership, not transnational playground.
Thanks a lot. There are two areas that really would be part of my program also that New York could have a special relationship with, which are Puerto Rico and Haiti. Haiti right now is just being used as a drug transshipment point, and the U.S. is pulling American citizens out of there. God knows what they have planned. It's a horror. Joel DeJean has spoken of it. Something between 75 and 80% of the people there are depending on burning charcoal for their energy needs. And it would seem to me that the U.S. and China, with, of course, the agreement and cooperation of the government of Haiti, which would stop orienting toward Taiwan, but toward China, could take that as a place for a joint collaboration in real economic development. Similarly, Puerto Rico, which is nominally a protectorate of the United States, and you see what that means, which is just you let the place go. You don't rebuild the power lines to withstand hurricanes. They had a beautiful telescope, Arecibo, which had been doing actually very important work, one of the few in the world, and for some the only in the world, identifying comets and asteroids that might be coming our way. That somehow was destroyed by a storm, by, I don't know, other means. There's no commitment to rebuild it. There was an incredible science program around that telescope to educate young people from there. So again, there are places where if we had the vision that President Putin does of recognizing a great opportunity, a great potential, where we could be part of fostering growth in a nation or a region that could establish a strong middle class, which would be interested in trade with the continental United States. That's what I think the Chinese would call win-win cooperation, or Henry Carey, harmony of interests, where you are raising the standard as opposed to collapsing the standard. So I think it's about time to wrap up. I just ask if you have any closing thoughts.
I'm very glad to hear what you say about Puerto Rico and Haiti, because imagine, schools just started in the United States. We have teacher shortages. We have some COVID again. We have flu. But imagine if every week a child or a classroom or an assembly was called and said, okay, today we'll have our update on Puerto Rico. Here's what we did this weekend. We'll have our update on what we could do in Haiti. We'll have our update on, do you know where Afghanistan is? And guess what? Here's what, just think of that instead of our counseling on what sex you might be or what you think. I think that we have a job to do, but I think it could catch on.
I think you're right. And one other complicating factor here in New York is that since New York City has not absorbed, I should say, because they're not absorbed, but we've had now 107,000 migrants brought in through New York City, and they're saying 19,000 children are going to be enlisting in the New York City public schools, most of whom don't speak English. The city is just not prepared. It's a disaster. The city already couldn't handle the 100,000 homeless children in the public schools. That's 1 out of 10. That was the situation in 2018. And they're not randomly sprinkled about. There are some schools where over 50% of the class is homeless. And these children are not having breakfast, wondering if their mother is getting assaulted in the shelter, unable to concentrate. How you can teach people at their most impressionable part of life under these conditions is beyond me. I think it's one of the most cruel things occurring, and we really need a crash program to address it. And I'll just say to that end, 2 announcements. One, if you're watching this webcast and you think what we are saying here is important, please donate to my campaign at SareForSenate.com if you are a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. 2, on Saturday, September 9th, which is the day after the 101st birthday of Lyndon LaRouche, the late Lyndon LaRouche, Saturday, September 9th will be a very important International Schiller Institute conference. And on Sunday, September 10th, there may be a third panel of the conference. There will also be a live concert and online in New York City, done by the Schiller Institute New York City Chorus, our annual 9/11 memorial, which is very important. People want to forget the turning point that was, and we cannot forget it. It was a very bad turning point for the nation, for the forever wars, for police state measures, and we owe it to everyone who perished in that or its aftermath to reverse the evil that has come to mankind as a result. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening. Thank you, Marcia, so much.
Thanks, Diane. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you. And I hope to see everyone next week.